Welcome to the Benwood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Benwood Johnson podcast. Today is April 29, 2019, and this is podcast number 28. Once again, I am very, very happy, very content to have you back with us one more time for another installment of the Benwood Johnson podcast. Dr. Johnson's here. Today we are going to debate a very peculiar topic, but it is somewhat related to everything we have debated before. The reason it is related to everything we've debated before, it is because, we've talked about, Sartre. We have talked about existentialism. We've talked about the concept of freedom, the notion of rights. We have talked about technology, how the individual, the being is sort of restricted, in terms of how the individual could survive in society. And we have also talked about notions of war, peace, and human rights and whatnot. But today we're going to be talking about the individualism. And the reason this is important, it is because, individuality is the foundation of everything we have talked about so far. You could not have freedom in society. We could not have freedom unless there's an individuality. In order for you to be on your own, you have to be on your own, or at least you have to be able to be on your own. And this is the quintessence of my argument. This is the quintessence of my philosophy, because I do not believe this is the case. I do not believe that human beings have the capacity to be on their own. I do not believe that nature created the being, or any being for that matter. It does not have to be a human being. It does not have to be something other than a humanoid. But the concept that the being gets to be on his own, I will argue in this podcast, is a fallacy. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. The foundation of everything human is based on two basic principles. The first principle is the notion of what we call collectivism. In this case, the collective, the sides, or the collective puts together structures which defines a society, which defines a group within a society. Therefore, that society is driven by the collective, hence collectivism. The second approach is the notion of individualism. Individualism is the notion that the individual is the foundation of everything human. In other words, the collective would not exist if it weren't for the individual. Today, let us delve a little bit deeper on the notion of individualism. What is individualism? What does it mean to be individual within a collective? Is it even possible to have individuality within the confound or within the realm of what is known as collectivism? In other words, could you be an individual while you evolve in a collective environment? Now, before we go further, let us try to make sense of what is individualism. What does it mean? Whenever we're talking about individualism, the first thing that comes to mind is that it is a philosophy. It is a philosophy that is mostly political. And when we say political, the concept here, at least the understanding here, is that it is based on certain views which are moral at their core. Now, we have to understand when we're talking about morality, when we're talking about anything moral, the underlying understanding here is that it has to come from a higher understanding. Now, in previous podcasts, we have talked about the concept of morality. We've talked about the concept of divinity within the confound of what is religion, spiritualism, and all that. But the foundation of anything political is moral as well. And anything moral has to do with a higher instance. And that higher instance is based on the notion of what is commonly understood as righteousness. It has to be righteous. It has to be the right thing to do, the right thing to be, the right place to be, and the right way to act or to be. Anytime we're referring to a political philosophy, we have to go back to this notion of morality. Thereby, we have to go back to this notion of higher power. In many cases, in most societies, we have to go back to the notion of God Himself. Okay? So, when we're talking about political philosophy, we're not talking about something religious at its core. We're not talking about something secular at its core. But there's this amalgam, if you will, between what is righteous, thereby something that comes from morality, thereby by God itself, and also what is human, what is not necessarily related to religion, and in which case we're talking about what is secular. Okay? But the nuance is relatively blurry. Okay? So which is not necessarily clear, except that we decide which to believe, which we think is. But the foundation of political philosophy is this idea that there is something righteous in the way we are. There's something righteous in the way we ought to be. There's something righteous in the way things are. There is something righteous in the way things ought to be. And because it is based on views in terms of which is or which is not, there's always dissenting views. There's always disagreements as to which is which makes it, in essence, political. But when we're talking about individualism, this understanding is based on what we call a political philosophy, whereby it is a moral understanding, a moral viewpoint as to what the individual is worth. It is a moral approach as to what is it that the individual is entitled to. Of course, whatever it is that the individual is entitled to is always going to get back to this concept of righteousness. The individual is supposed to be the right way. The individual is entitled to the right thing. The individual is supposed to be the right way. And we ought to treat the individual the right way. So when we're talking about this concept of political philosophy within the purview or the notion of individualism, what we're talking about is that the individual is supposed to be a certain way. We ought to treat the individual a certain way. The individual has a moral worth. And that moral value is the foundation of the individual. Of course, when we're talking about this concept, we have to see where or why it is the foundation of everything human. Thereby, the concept itself is subjective, meaning not taking into account the realities of the entities that evolve in a particular milieu, or social milieu in this case. Nonetheless, the understanding when we're talking about individualism, we're talking about this political philosophy. It is this understanding, this view, this worldview, which establishes the moral independence, the moral worth of the individual. Now, the question you might be asking yourself at this point is, how does that conflict, or how does this understanding conflict with the notion of collectivism? Now, this conversation is not about contrasting the two concepts. That is not what I am doing here. Therefore, I'm not going to delve into the concept of collectivism, okay? But I must point out, we could not have the individual without the collective, vice versa. Now the question is, at which point their moral worth overlaps? At which point there is a clear distinction between what is individual and what is collective. And I think that's where the debate sort of takes a murkier stance, because it is not clear. Of course, going back to the concept itself, it is an ideology. And by that I mean, it is a way of looking at the world. It is a way of seeing one's world. It is a way of looking at what things are and what things ought to be, again, which takes us back to the concept of righteousness, which takes us back to the notion of God himself. Okay? But the foundation of this concept, when we're talking about individuality, we have to take into account that the individual was born into a collective. The first society, if you will, is mom and dad. Okay? The nucleus of every society is the family. And by that, I mean mom and dad. When you were born into a society of two. And you became an addition to that society and became the third. Just right there, you are part of a collective. Certainly, you could claim your individuality, and you do have an individuality. But that individuality is also mingled with the individuality of the others. In this case, your mom and your dad. Mom has a way of seeing the world. Dad certainly has a way of seeing his world, which at some point are going to differentiate between the way you see the world and the way they see the world. And when you start seeing the world differently in relation to how mom and dad see their world, you are affirming your identity, your individuality. And the same principle applies when we're talking about society as a whole. Because when we're talking about different sets of families or different sets of individuals living within a collective, in other words, a group of families which forms the collective itself, or the society as we know it, there are individual entities, there are units of beings that see the world differently. Therefore, trying to claim or assert their identity within that collective. But that collective could only be when it takes away the individuality of this entity that is part of it. So just to put it in a different perspective, you as a unit are part of a collective entity. And let's go back to the concept of mom and dad. Okay? Let us say that I am the only son of my mother and father. The three of us make up this unit called family. And we could call this unit society, a small society of three, if you will. So you, as a member of a society of three, you have your identity, mom has her identity, and dad has his identity. Nonetheless, as a family or as a society, we also have an identity. And that identity is our identity. Let's say that this is a Johnson family, right? Father's name is Johnson, mother's name is Johnson, and my name is Johnson, right? So as a family, we have a Johnson's identity. That identity sometimes differ from the individual identity. So in other words, me being a part of the Johnson family doesn't necessarily mean that I am a Johnson intrinsically. Okay? So what that means is that I am part of the Johnson family. At which point could I claim to be different from Johnson? Could I wake up one morning and say, you know what, mom, you know what, dad, I don't want to be a part of this family anymore? Could I take back the fact that I was born into this family? Is this something that I have the power to do? Could I wake up one morning and say, you know what? I don't want to be a Johnson anymore. But what I'm saying here is that could you decide not to be a part of this collective of three? And if you couldn't do it, then you have absolutely no power over your individuality. You could claim that. You could claim not to be a part of the Johnson family, but would that make it so in the eyes of the society where you evolve? Would that make it so intrinsically? Could you decide not to be a Johnson when you were born a Johnson? If you were born into a collective, could you claim an individuality? Of course, the argument could be made that some individuals were born orphan, and because of technology, the advances in medicine, we are able to create individuals from scratch. There's an argument to be made here. Still, that individual didn't create itself or himself. So whoever or whatever that individual is, he is still part of a collective. Might not be a collective of three, okay? But it is certainly not going to be a unit on its own. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that any entity in nature was created on its own. There's a chain link connection with everything that exists in the world, in the natural world, so to speak. Could you claim your individuality when you're part of a collective? And if you are part of a collective, what are the collective's responsibilities towards you? What are your responsibilities towards the collective? These are some of the questions that could only be answered from an ideological standpoint. From a political standpoint, we could never be objective in the way we answer similar questions. But to go back to the concept of individuality, when we are talking about individuality, what are we talking about exactly? Is it a fantasy? Is it real? Can you be you simply by being you? Or are you always part of something else? I could answer this question by saying, you could never be you unless you accept that you are part of something else. By accepting that you're part of something else, you could claim a semi or a pseudo identity. A semi-identity or a pseudo-identity. And what that means is that you can only be within the purview of the entity from which you are, or you were, or you came out. In the example about the Johnson family, I could still be a Johnson, but I could be a Johnson on my own. I don't have to be a Johnson like my mom was. I don't have to be a Johnson like my dad was. But I could be my own Johnson. Of course, I would still have the remnants of my mom and dad's in me, but I could claim my own Johnson over time. So that individuality on its own, it's not individual. It's not individuality, okay? Because I am still part of the collective, okay? And there's still remnants of the other members of the Johnson family and me. But let us approach the term individualism from a different angle. There is this understanding that whenever we're talking about individuality, we're talking about an inherent independence in the being. Of course, this idea or this view is the foundation of existentialism, as Jean-Paul Sartre sort of made it famous. It's this idea that the individual is sort of a detached entity, is an independent being on its own, right? On his own. So the individual is not encumbered by anything or anyone. And the individual is free to be. And within that freedom to be, the individual gets to claim his or its independence from anything else. But there's an incongruity in this idea. How could an individual be independent by himself? How is that possible? The individual did not create himself or itself. At some point, the individual must have belonged to some other entities. And if the individual were to claim any sort of independence from that entity, would that be real independence? Would that be a true independence? And if not, how could we classify that independence, if independence we could consider it to be? These are important questions. Nobody has come up with any answers so far to tackle this question. How could you be free when you are still part of a collective? How could you be independent when you rely on others to be? Is that independence? If you are able to care for yourself, let's say you are able to find your own food, Is that independence? Let's say you're able to take care of yourself, find your own clothes, dress yourself, have a place to stay, feed yourself. Basically, you are taking care of yourself. Is that independence? Is that freedom? Freedom from what? Independence from whom? From what? Could you be independent? Really? Can you be free? Really? Can you have individualism? Really? How would that look like? There's nothing in the world today. There's nothing in nature today that can be independent. The concept of independency does not exist in the natural. Nothing is independent in nature. Nothing, no one, no entity is free in nature. Everything is based on something. Everyone relies on someone else in one way or another. Your survival, my survival, depend on how we interact in society, in our environment. Could the lion claim to be independent from the zebra? Could a zebra claim to be independent from a lion? Could a prey claim to be independent from a predator? Could a predator claim to be independent from a prey? Could a hunter claim to be independent from the animals or the entity that he or she hunts? Is that possible? No. Because at the end of the day, that entity depends on another entity to be. Your existence is incumbent upon everything else around you. Your independence, if you think that you have it, is perhaps non-existent. Your independence, whatever you think it might be, does not exist really. Your individuality is just this, it's a fantasy. It's a make-believe where you believe I am independent. I get to be. To be how? You cannot be unless somebody else allows you to be, unless you rely on something else or someone else. How independent are you, really? If you depend on something else, on someone in one way or another, then you are not independent right off the bat. Just within your natural state of being, you cannot be by yourself. You cannot be on your own. You have to depend on something at some point. So the concept of independency, it's a fallacy. It's nothing but a fallacy. It's a fallacy, but it's a fallacy that makes us feel good about ourselves. It makes us feel good about who we are, who we think we are, but not necessarily who we really are. Because we are dependent beings. We are dependent. We cannot be free when we have wire connected to our beingness. Man is a wired entity. Everything about manhood requires the being to be wired, to be attached, to be based somewhere. Man has to have a base from which to launch itself. And when it is airborne, so to speak, it still has to go back to the point of departure, to the point where it launched itself. Is man independent? No. Can you claim individuality when everything about you is related to others? It's a fallacy. You claim to be independent when you're not, and you know you're not. You are dependent. You are only when you can be within the collective. That's why it is important for us to understand that dependency. Because sometimes we don't understand. We overlook that dependency. And because we overlook that dependency, we tend to let the other be when the other cannot be unless we allow him to be. And when we let the other to wander in the natural wilderness, the other is lost. The other cannot find his way or its way. Because the other is supposed to rely on you, on us, in order to be. The lion would not survive the season if he doesn't eat a couple of zebras. And perhaps the zebras know that as well. The zebras know that a couple of us are going to feed the lion this year. They know. It's a natural process. The hunter has to hunt. Hunt what? Whom? Another living being. Be it a deer or wild birds. But the hunter has to hunt. The hunted knows. The hunted knows it has to be hunted. It knows. It is part of the natural process. So we are dependent. I, as a member of the Johnson family, will always be a member of the Johnson family. Even though I might claim to be different from my dad, even though I might claim to be different from my mom and trying to assert my identity, at the end of the day, I am still part of the Johnson family. And in this case, I am still part of the human species. As a member of the human species, I am dependent on the species in order to survive. I am also dependent on other species within the natural in order to survive. I need the lions. I need the zebras. I need the deers. I need the birds. I need the crocodiles. I need everything, because everything in the natural is part of my existence. We are part of the collective. We are a member, a unit, if you will, of a collective being, which is life itself. If you want to call it Mother Nature, do. But the bottom line is that we are part of an entity. And we could never be separate from that entity, because our existence is incumbent upon that entity's existence. So we are a part of that entity forever. And we are always going to be a part of everything else within that entity. We could not claim any independency. We could not claim any individuality when we are part of a collective, when we are part of an entity. And that entity is life itself. So when we're talking about individuality, we have to take into account that it is a fallacy. It is a concept that makes us feel good about ourselves, that we get to be on our own. And it feels good to feel that way. But in reality, we don't, because everything we do is incumbent upon somebody else. It's incumbent upon another entity. Sometimes it is within our own species, other times it is in other species. So at the end of the day, we are dependent beings. We depend on each other. We depend on others. Now, on a side note, it is also important to understand the nuance that I am trying to establish here. On the one hand, when we're talking about individuality, we are talking about this independency where we are on our own. The individual is on his own. On the other hand, we are also part of a collective in which we still retain aspects of our individuality. And what that means is that we depend on the other or on others in order to be. But we also depend on ourselves in order to be. So we have to find our own way within the collective. Okay? We have to be able to find ourselves within the collective. And that's when society comes in and plays an important role. Because when you evolve in a society that allows you to be, at the same time recognizing that you are part of a collective, that opens the door for you to be. In which case it allows the collective to be as well. When you evolve in a society that does not allow you to be, but requires you to be in a way that facilitates its own beingness, then that collective runs the risk of losing it all. Because at the end of the day, your extinction as an entity also affects the collective as an entity. So the relationship is bidirectional. It is not a unidirectional relationship where society depends on you or you don't depend on society. Society needs you so much as you need society. But society has to allow you to be so that you can make it possible for society to continue being. So what that means as a whole is that the being is a dependent being. Recognizing that dependency is crucial, is important for the being to be. recognizing that dependency is also quintessential in order for the collective to be. And that symbiotic relationship, that symbiose, if you will, is the foundation of humanity. It is also the core of the natural, of existence on its own. And in recognizing that dependency, that's what's going to make our living experience bearable. That's what's going to make our beingness acceptable, livable, and that's life.